My name is Katie Lewis, and I'm a publicist at Princeton University Press. In late 2018, I travelled to Bath to meet Juliet Stevenson as she finished recording the audiobook for Why Nationalism by Yael Tamir. Juliet Stevenson, you're a prolific narrator of audiobooks, having lent your voice to a great number of titles, including the complete works of Jane Austen. I was wondering, how did you get into audiobook narration?
I think the very first audiobook I ever recorded was a very long novel by Catherine Cookson. And it was because my first ever television series was The Mallons, which was a series of novels by Catherine Cookson set in the Peak District, actually. Anyway, so I guess when that went out, I was associated with the series. And so they asked me to read an audiobook of hers. And it was probably the toughest book 40 years later, that remains the toughest book I've ever read out loud, because there were like sort of 45, Geordie working class housewives standing on a pavement chatting, and you somehow had to differentiate between one and the other. And, Geordie's a tough accent. If you don't come from the Northeast, it's hard to get it really right. So, yeah, that was through the agency. But I have loved doing them. So, yes, I often do them in between sort of long, bigger jobs because it's really a great pleasure.
So you've been recording audiobooks for 40 years, you said?
On and off, yes. All my working life.
And so things must be quite different now to back then. How has audiobook recording changed in that time?
I'm not really aware of much difference. You go into a dark, small booth, you open up your script and you read. Technology has obviously advanced, but that's not something I'm particularly aware of. From my point of view, it's much the same. Reading stories out loud has, not changed, I don't suppose, for centuries, really. It's a very old human habit, whether you're telling those stories orally or from the written word. And I think people always have and always will want stories read out loud to them. I wouldn't say that it's changed a great deal. Things like rock and roll came in, which is a way of recording where you self-edit as you go along. So where you fluff, you go back to the point just before and then you pick it up so that the mistake is recorded out on the spot. I don't think we used to read like that at the beginning, and now you quite often do, which just saves editing time later on. But other than that, no, it's still the same job, really.
And are you a listener of audiobooks yourself?
Yeah, I really love listening, and my kids have been avid audiobook listeners all their lives. I think I always read to them at night in, bedtime, and then they got to a certain age. I think what happened first, my daughter, I read her the first 5 Harry Potter books, and then I just couldn't keep up with her appetite for them. So then she listened to the remaining 2 on audiobook. But yeah, all the kids, I've got 4 kids between us, and they all love and listen to regularly audiobooks. On a daily basis, I'd say. And my daughter, who's now 24, listens to all kinds of things and podcasts and stuff, but she still listens to the Harry Potter series. She's listened hundreds of times over to those. So they have ones that are new, and they also have old, familiar favourites. I guess I'm talking about the kids because I don't really have a lot of time to listen to stuff, but we sometimes do when we're driving long distances, and which is kind of the perfect environment for listening to an audiobook, I think.
Do you find the experience of revisiting a book to narrate it brings out new aspects of the work that you hadn't got from it when just reading in your head?
Oh, yeah, hugely. It's really, really different to read it out loud, to reading inside your head. For a start, and one of the great joys of the job is that you have to inhabit every single character when they speak. And so you're playing old men, babies, dogs, grandmothers, cross-class, cross-gender, cross-age, cross-everything. And that's one of the things I love most about it, is you have to find the voice for, sometimes dozens or even hundreds of characters. Something like Middlemarch by George Eliot, which is about 1,000 pages long, you're huge tapestry of characters. So, and when you're inhabiting a character in order to read their dialogue off the page, you make a relationship with that character which is different to when you're just reading the book inside your head. Because when you're reading inside your head just to yourself, you're reading the story and the narration and the thoughts and observations of the writer, but you're not delving into characters as an actor at all. It's all sort of evenly spread. But when you're reading it out loud, you have to make decisions about how that character sounds. And then that informs your relationship to that character. And you're feeling what drives them, what motivates them, how they may be seeming brave, but they are in fact frightened, or they, they're layered. They're more perhaps layered than if you were just reading them on the page. So I think it's a very different relationship. And then also, every piece of written literature, whether it's a play or a book, once you read it out loud, there is the question of rhythm. And the rhythms of any piece of text communicate loads of meaning just by the rhythms, which is not something that a reader will necessarily notice or understand, but they will be very affected by it. And that's obviously true in dramatic literature. So you're reading a speech of Shakespeare, which is written in blank verse, and the rhythms and the shape of that verse will inform the meaning. And just this physical sound of language carries meaning in it way beyond the literal sense. And that's also true of novels and books that you're reading out loud. So it's another plus, really. And when any great writer will have an amazing musical ear to rhythm. And the writer is not a great writer very often when the rhythms are difficult. They don't flow, they're not smooth. There is no ear for that in the writer. They're much harder to read. So even though those 19th century novels like, the Brontes or Dickens or earlier, Jane Austen and so on, they're huge sentences. They go on for a whole paragraph very often. They've got subclause and then sub-subclause. But they're not that difficult because those writers all had an amazing musical ear, so the rhythm sort of carries you. That's perhaps the thing I love most about reading out loud.
How do you prepare for reading a book?
Well, there's two main jobs, I think. I feel very strongly that we're just here to serve the writer. It's not the reader's job to sort of do lots of heavy interpreting, and I think you're a conduit, you're like a vessel through which the book is passing and its characters, but you mustn't too much get in the way. So the first job, I think, is to look at the writer's style and tone and try and reflect that in the choices you make as you read it. I mean, some writers are very minimal, very clean, very spare. I'm thinking of people like Coetzee, the great South African writer. The more modern the novel, very often you get this very lean, clean, spare style and quite a cool tone. And it's important to find the right tone for each writer and try and reflect his or her choice. Then, you get these 19th century novels which are much more embellished with loads of adjectives and adverbs, and you can reflect that. You have to reflect that. So tone on the one hand, and then secondly, I would prepare the characters. So you have to know who every character is. How old are they? What does their voice sound like? And in my head, I often cast them. The big challenge is when you've got a scene with maybe 8, 10, 20 characters all talking to each other, and you have to jump from one person's dialogue to the next, to the next, to the next. And you can't keep stopping and adjusting your character, to shift from one person to another. So if you cast them in your head, I might think of an actor, or I might think of somebody from my life. I might think of the lollipop lady on the street outside my kid's school. I might think of, a school mum. I might think of a relative or somebody I know who just would seem to be the right voice for a particular character. And then I cast him or her in my head. And then it's a very quick jump. You immediately go into that voice. And then you go into the next voice and then back to the first and so on. And yeah, that's a lot of fun, is finding the right pitch, rhythm, tone. Do they speak quickly? Do they speak slowly? Are they broken? Are they fluent? Do they have an accent? Is it a high, clear tone? Is it a deep, gravelly tone? Is it nasal? Have they got a cold? There's hundreds and hundreds of choices. So I make sure that I write notes on each person, the dynamic of the person's speech and a few details about them. And then, when you are at page 652 and you've got a new character coming, you can quickly locate those notes and slip into her or him quickly, particularly with Jane Austen, George Eliot and all those people. That's the challenge, really, because they're vast and they've got huge panoply of people in those novels. So you've got to prepare reasonably carefully.
It's interesting what you just said about deciding on the character's accent and tone of voice and so on when reading a novel. The book you're narrating for Princeton University Press today, Why Nationalism, is non-fiction. So I was wondering, do you prepare for reading fiction and non-fiction in different ways? And does non-fiction have its own set of unique challenges?
Yeah, I think this might be the first non-fiction book I've ever recorded. I can't think that I've done one of these before, and it felt very different. First of all, there are no characters. So then who is speaking? It's the writer. So I would do the same job in trying to establish the style of the writer, her tone, but I'm not inhabiting anybody else. It's just her words. And in this case, she's exploring all sorts of political, economic, social ideas. It's sort of political philosophy, if you like. So the challenge is you're not really telling a story. You're exploring an argument or many arguments. So I didn't really know how to do this, but when I got into the studio with lovely Mary Price, the producer, she stopped me at first and said, no, it sounds too much as though you're reading. I want to hear you talking about this. And it's true, you can't really read as though you're reading a narrative. You're not telling a story. You're quite aware as a listener that the reader is reading prose, and that's fine because that's what they're doing. When she's arguing through a political case for or against nationalism or for or against globalization or whatever it is, you've really got to sound as though you're just exploring this argument in a conversation. So we ended up with my imagining, really, that I was talking to somebody across the table. We were having this conversation over a cup of tea or something, and I was talking through my ideas. The strange experience was that these, of course, not my ideas, and I didn't always agree with this writer. Sometimes I did, sometimes I didn't. I think the challenge of this book was that, it is a book where Yael Tamir is exploring all sorts of political ideas. She is trying to analyze the current situation globally and nationally, and she is putting forth her arguments for why she thinks that nationalism has emerged as a strong force in many parts of the world and so on. So it's a very subjective piece of political argument by the writer. It's very interesting. But it involves a lot of long words and a lot of quite solid, chunky political thinking. Now, to make that something that somebody would want to listen to is challenging. It's very, very interesting. The book is very interesting. It's not that. It's just that hearing that read to you is much, much more difficult than reading it yourself. I think when you're reading a book yourself and you're reading political theory or ideas, like this book, then you read it slowly and carefully, and perhaps you'd repeat a sentence so you were sure that you understood, what she was saying, the point she was making. But an audiobook listener is not going to be constantly rewinding to hear a sentence reread. So you've got to try and make it very clear. And sometimes it'll be a long sentence with subclauses, and it's not a story that's going to captivate the imagination of the reader. It's theoretical. These are political ideas, and they include a lot of political thought and formulae and theory. So the challenge is to make it something that people are going to go on listening to and can hear and absorb, so that they understand what they're listening to and can go with the flow of her argument.
What attracted you to this particular project?
I am, as a person, very interested in politics and feel quite engaged with both world and national events. I mean, it's a huge interest in my life, and I'm sure, like most people, I'm sort of bewildered and very often appalled by the speed with which world and national events have happened recently and the impact and the fallout of those political events on ordinary people and their lives. So quite a lot of my life is dedicated to doing what I can in my own tiny way, my little patch, to sort of work with refugees and those who have fallen foul of economic and political systems that have consistently ignored them, or the marginalised in this country for that matter. So I'm very interested in this stuff, and it did really appeal to me to read a book where those things are being explored, and where she is asking, Yael Tamir is asking, how have we come to this place? I didn't read the entire book before I started recording it. You very often don't, so you keep up with it. You've always pre-read before you record, but you may not have finished the entire work before you start recording on day one. So I wasn't sure what conclusions she would draw. I did feel strongly that I wouldn't be able to read a book that I profoundly disagreed with. That would just feel weird. And there is quite a lot in this book that I wouldn't necessarily sign my name to, but I also, do agree with her about some of it, but it doesn't matter. I'm not really, it's not my book. It's very much Yael Tamir's book, and I'm just giving it voice. And it's a really interesting time to be asking the questions she's asking. Nationalism is a huge force, as she rightly identifies, and its different forms are emerging and taking root all over the world. So it's a hugely important subject, and I think it's a interesting and engaging exploration of that subject, whatever people feel about what she says and whether they agree or not. It's not sort of beside the point in a way. To have the discourse is really vital. And so, yes, I was very pleased to be asked to do it and to go with her in her argument and see where it led in her mind. And I don't agree with everything, but I have learnt quite a lot from reading it.
And now that you've finished narrating the book, has your view of nationalism changed?
I think it has shifted my thinking. I mean, I suppose that our encounters with nationalism in the last months and years recently have been very much that kind of nationalism that comes into the media, comes onto the news because it's coming from the alt-right. It's coming from very, very right-wing movements in Europe or whatever, and is presented like, the National Front or English Defence League or Trump is in America or, Make America Great Again, the movement, and so on. Of course, the Brexit situation here has encouraged and released a lot of quite extreme forms of nationalism into the zeitgeist. So I think she rightly identifies it as something which we have all, if you're not of the alt-right, which most people are not, thankfully, that it's something which we're afraid of, and it's become synonymous with extreme right-wing politics, which are xenophobic, very often racist and white supremacist even, and so on, all things which I strongly loathe and would, march in the street against. I have been very interested by her argument that actually we need to claim nationalism back from the extreme right-wing movements, and we need to recognise that people do have a strong sense of nationhood. People do feel Scottish, they feel Irish, they feel Welsh, they feel English, or they feel, Catalonian, they feel they are Kurds, they're not necessarily Turks, So I think that what she's identifying is a very strong need in people to identify with their national group. And if there is a way of doing that, which is to celebrate your culture, your history, your language, your traditions in a way that's still non-prejudicial to others, which still welcomes interchange with difference and with cultural, religious difference and so on, that can be inclusive, that is harmonious, but still allows people to feel pride in the country that they feel they and their family belong to. And I think that's a very, very interesting and valid point. And if you need, as we all do, to really understand the forces that have brought us to this cold civil war, the Brexit legacy, then it's important to understand how that's impacted on ordinary people and why they felt that they weren't being represented when people talked always in bigger terms about being British even, let alone European, We talk about Scotland, we talk about Wales, we talk about Northern Ireland, all have their own assemblies, but England. Yeah, so I think she has a lot of very interesting arguments about reclaiming nationalism from the extreme and destructive, in my view, right-wing parties and seeing it as something which everybody everywhere on the planet has needed to have to say, yeah, I come from this bit of the planet, but I'm very happy to talk and live alongside others, but this is who I am and this is where I've come from and my family. So yes, in that sense, she stimulated a lot of thinking in my mind, which has been helpful.
What makes a good audiobook narrator, do you think?
Oh, what makes a good audiobook narrator? Well, I think you do have to be able to read fluently. I think it helps to have the ability to read entirely in the moment so that what you're reading is as fresh as if you were telling the story yourself from your own imagination. You're right in the present as you're reading. But you also have to have an eye to what's just coming up because you have to have a sense of the sentence's shape or the paragraph's shape. So I suppose that's sort of a bit like playing an instrument where you're just playing the note and then the next note, you're right in the moment. But you know that this bar and then this phrase and then this movement of the music is a certain shape too. So that's something which is useful to have. I guess it's quite useful to have the sort of voice that people find comfortable and easy to listen to. I personally think it's important not to get in the way of the writer. So you try and not impose your own response to the story in between the writer and the listener. You're delivering it up for the listener. The listener and the writer are the two most important people. I think it helps to be able to do accents and to have a versatile voice that can go up or down or different registers, so you can identify different characters very clearly, so that when the listener is listening to you, they know immediately which character is speaking. You don't want to be in any doubt about that. So if you've got, 4 old men leaning on a fence, having a chat, you've got to somehow find the difference between those 4 old men who may all be from the same village with the same accent and all be old and men. But you've got to find a way of making sure that when each speaks, that the listener knows exactly that's Fred, that's John, that's, whoever. Yeah, so there are some skills, but, it's mainly practice. I think experience and practice, like anything, gets you there.
And what do you enjoy the most about recording audiobooks?
I really, really love recording them. I'm very happy when I wake up in the morning and I think, what am I doing today? Oh yeah, I'm going to record an audiobook, and I'm going to go to a studio somewhere and go into that little dark booth and shut the door and be alone for 8 hours, with the odd tea break, with this author and his or her characters and her world. And I just love that experience, and I don't find it tiring. I've also always felt myself to be very undereducated. I didn't go to university. I went straight from school to drama school. I was quite well read by 18 and then very badly read by 30. And I consider myself to be not well read at all, really. So it's another joy is that you're getting paid to read literature. And I mean, I do try and only do books which I want to read or which I think would be great, or I don't particularly want to read, lots of airport novel stuff because life's a bit short for that. So I've been incredibly lucky to read all of Jane Austen, including all the obscure ones, and pretty much all the Brontes, including those ones that we don't ever really read. And I had never read any George Eliot by the time I left school. So now I've read most of her, which is like the greatest joy for me. I've been introduced to all sorts of writers I'd never heard of. It's been like an education. I really, really love doing it.
What advice would you give to an author who's writing a book with a view to it being turned into an audiobook?
Think about rhythm. Think about the rhythm of the spoken word. Maybe when you're writing, occasionally pick a random paragraph or 2 or 3 and read them out loud and see how the rhythms are working when they're read out loud as opposed to just inside your head. Think musically. I think that's all I would feel sort of entitled to say to any author. I mean, basically, it's miraculous what an author does, in my view. And if the book is good to read inside your head, it'll be good to read out loud too. If they're a good writer, they're really skilled, talented, they're probably going to have a musical, rhythmic sense anyway. Not all books do, but the better the writer, the stronger their sense of rhythm very often. So I wouldn't really presume to sort of give advice. I think you can read any kind of audiobook, with characters, without characters, all prose, 150 characters, people characters, not as in text characters. So I think I would just say think about rhythm, because that's hugely important when you're hearing the out loud version of a book.
Do you have any particular favourite authors to read in audio?
I love George Eliot with a huge passion. As I said, I'd never read her to myself before I was asked to record Middlemarch, which I think now is probably my desert island English novel, probably the greatest novel in the English language. If I had to choose one, I would choose Middlemarch. I think it's just a work of complete genius. It's like looking at one of those huge tapestries hanging on some castle wall where there's there are main characters in the centre of the weave. But then everywhere you look, you see detail. You see there's a woman breastfeeding in the background. There's some soldier fallen asleep. There's a rabbit chasing a mouse. There's a dog chasing a rabbit. There's a million things going on in that tapestry. And George Eliot's like that. It's this incredibly exhaustive and detailed human map of Middle England at the time of her writing. And it's full of complex human observation, brilliant observation of human dynamics and the layers and layers and layers that are at play in any exchange between 2 or more people. It's hugely generous of spirit. I mean, she's so compassionate. She's so clever. She's so witty. It's mind-boggling achievement. So probably it would be Middlemarch. But I also love Jane Austen, who is very ironic and very witty and very sardonic and naughty in her way. But I've loved reading modern stuff too. I mean, I really do. When there's a new novel coming out and I'm asked to read it, that's a great pleasure to me as well. Rose Tremaine, I've read a lot of Rose Tremaine for audiobook and I've loved that. Thrillers are always exciting, sensing that you're keeping people really dangling in terms of the plot, and she is very wonderful at that. Yeah.
And are there any projects you'd particularly like to work on in the near future?
I'd love to read more new novels by women writers. I would be chuffed as anything to be asked to read a new Zadie Smith, for example, or, Margaret Atwood. Oh, any number. There are so many fantastic women writing now. I feel very strongly about women's work, women's expression and women's writing. I'd love to be asked to do more of that. It's a very interesting time in the gender conversation, and I think that very often women writing, as has probably historically always been the case, have found themselves much freer. They're writing alone wherever they're doing that, and they are very free to explore their thoughts, ideas, observations and so on. They're not really being censored in the way they very often are in other media. So it's often a very pure form of feminine expression, and I'd love to read more modern novels by women.
Juliet Stevenson, thank you for speaking with me today.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you.
For more information about this and other audiobooks from Princeton University Press, please visit press.princeton.edu/audiobooks.